Okay, hello, welcome everybody. My name is Mariana Mota Prado. I'm a professor of law at the University of Toronto, and I'm going to be serving as the chair of this wonderful event. We are on the fourth day of the Semana de Abertura do Mestrado e Doutorado, which is the opening week for the graduate programs at the Faculty of Law of FGV. And today we're going to have two roundtables with authors that have contributed to a project that was just published. So we have had a 2-year-long project on law and systemic corruption, and the contributions to this project have now been published in 2 special issues, one of the University of Toronto Law Journal, the second one at Direito GV, the law journal of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation Law School. You can see the link for the publication at the bottom of the screen, and can take a look at the pieces that are open access to the public. And today we're going to be having a fascinating conversation with the authors about their contributions to this project. So I'm privileged to have here in this first roundtable Caio Mário da Silva Pereira Neto from FGV, Kevin Davis from NYU, Raquel Matos Pimenta from FGV as well, Vincent Chow, my colleague at the University of Toronto, and Vivian Ferreira from the University of São Paulo. And I'm going to get us started by asking the first question to all the authors, which is the general theme of your project is whether and how law can be deployed to curb systemic corruption. So the question is, how does your research help us answer that question? And how do you think your project in particular has advanced the literature on this topic? So I'm going to go around the table in alphabetical order of first names, which means we're starting with Caio.
Hi, Mariana. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to participate in this project. So thank you, Mariana, Raquel, Kevin, that coordinated the whole project together with Marta. And thanks to the co-authors here that are all great. So good to be part of this discussion here today. So my contribution to the project was a paper together with Professor Alison Jones from King's College London. And we focused on the lessons learned from Operation Car Wash. I think many of the different articles in this project were inspired somehow in what happened in Operation Car Wash in Brazil, but also trying to draw lessons that could be broader, right? Dealing with systemic corruption in other contexts as well. So we tried to understand what happened in Operation Car Wash and what are the lessons that we can draw from there. And I believe this, what happened in Brazil, helps not only understanding how law can help to curb systemic corruption, but also how law actually could, at first place, help to create the problem. So let me deal with both issues. So regarding the emergence of systemic corruption, when we try to look at what happened in Brazil, we think that as any complex problem, systemic corruption has many causes, right? Some of them may be deeply rooted in the legal systems, others are not related directly with the legal system. So if we look at legal issues, we believe that the design of our public procurement system may have helped, for instance, the emergence of systemic corruption in the case of car wash, because the public procurement system in Brazil excluded some of the outsiders like foreign companies and foreign firms. It also attributed a lot of discretion, especially at state-owned enterprises, with a lot of opacity, so that it was not transparent how the different companies were hired in that particular context. Also, the lack of law enforcement gave a sense of impunity for a long time and also played a role in the emergence of systemic corruption here. We also found that the design of the political system with fragile coalitions that were glued with incentives around public spending was also a part of the problem. And some of the campaign finance rules may also have contributed here. So the legal system can create an environment where systemic corruption can emerge. That's one issue. Then we started looking at how the legal system can react, right? A part of it was enforcement. So part of it, when we look at the experience in Brazil, was a multi-layered sense of enforcement that we had for a while, at least. So we had at least 6 layers that we map, and we try to understand what happened in these 6 layers. So criminal investigations, anti-corruption investigations at administrative level, antitrust investigations looking at collusion, federal accounting court investigations looking at public spending in general, then the Ministério Público with administrative improbity lawsuits and seeking for damages as well as political consequences such as mandate revocations. So what we see here is a reaction of the legal system in multiple layers of enforcement. And I think that's part of ways of dealing with systemic corruption that we saw emerging. But certainly what also car wash teaches us is that enforcement by itself, or just a big push in enforcement, is not the solution of all the problems. Actually, it can lead to also distortions. We saw also problems and backlashes, including legitimacy of the whole investigation at different points as well. So what we started thinking out of this is how can we promote legal reform that can actually help dealing with all these issues that we diagnose as part of the emergence of the problem. So what we propose here, because we understand that enforcement by itself is not solving the problem on one hand, and because we don't see room for a big bang approach, as we say it in the literature, and saying, look, let's just make an overhaul of the entire system and the political system in Brazil, for instance. This would be very hard to do, as we saw in the past few years with a big backlash and fight of corruption. So what we propose is what we call a 3-pronged approach of specific reforms that can reinforce each other. So that's how we see it. So, and we believe this 3-pronged approach could be focused first in measures that could weaken ties among businesses, public officials, and politicians. So like changing appointment procedures in state-owned enterprises, reducing barriers to entry in procurement so that we can have more players and make it more difficult to have collusion, so on and so forth. So this would be a first round of reforms that we could tackle. Second one is to propose adjustments in the public procurement system to make it more difficult for corruption and collusion to occur. More transparency, lower barriers to entry, better training of procurement officials, whistleblowing techniques, so on and so forth. And third, we propose reforms to challenge the sense of impunity and to improve enforcement, make it more efficient, solve problems that we saw with car wash, so reduce overlaps of enforcement, have more cooperation among agencies, streamline whistleblowing, and things along these lines. We believe if these 3 types of reforms can happen together, they can reinforce each other. That's our main issue here. So making the legal system to work together in different fronts could be a way of dealing, or at least improving, the whole environment here. So at the core of this proposal, and with this I come to an end, Mariana, with the core of these proposals is really the need to a closer alignment of public procurement, anti-corruption, and anti-competition and competition policies that could have a tighter coordination between procurement officials and enforcement agencies. If we can do all that, we believe the environment would be better. We could break this a vicious circle of these close connections of business people and public procurement and politicians, and we could have a better environment up front. So that's how we see the legal system working here to improve the environment in general. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing all the answers and to interacting with the other authors.
Thank you, Caio, and I think that's a fantastic paper. I always tell my students, if you see someone proposing a silver bullet, be skeptical. So I think this multi-layer self-reinforcing is often, I think, way more appealing and credible. Now, I failed as a moderator to make a disclaimer at the beginning, opening statement. So this applies to everything that Caio just said and everything that will be said from now on. And here's the disclaimer: all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represents their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event on their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV official channels. So with that out of the way, I'm turning to Kevin.
Thanks, Mariana. It's a pleasure to be here. Just to respond to the same kind of question, I guess the first paper I contributed to the symposium really tried to take the kinds of insights that Kaya was describing, which I think are familiar in a way, or sort of seem intuitively sensible and reasonable to lawyers. And to situate them in the broader social science literature on anti-corruption measures, where I don't think that there's as much of a sense that that law has a valuable role to play. Because there is a strand in the modern literature that suggests that systemic corruption is something that's it's universal, it's pervasive, it's irresistible, it's driven by broad social forces, and is really impervious to legal interventions, that it will only change when society as a whole changes, when there's a massive cultural shift, maybe economic growth and global integration, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very pessimistic perspective. And so I think it's important to at least probe that. So the first step in the paper I submitted and that I spoke about at the beginning of the symposium was just trying to unpack the concept of systemic corruption, because there's a lot of confusion around it, right? The term is used in several different ways. And so I suggest sometimes it means corruption that's widespread, not necessarily pervasive, right? And it might be just widespread in a particular domain, even a particular agency. It might just be in the police or at the high level of government, or low level of government, but widespread is part of it. Persistent. There's a sense that sometimes it's structural, driven by structural causes, like, say, campaign finance or the public procurement rules, as opposed to necessarily any deficiency in the enforcement regimes. So those are sometimes associated with. There's also sometimes a sense that systemic corruption is of the subversive kind, where the institutions that are supposed to guard against corruptions have themselves been corrupted. And that is a particularly pernicious form of corruption. It's not the only way in which we use the term systemic corruption, but it's sometimes used that way. So I thought it was helpful to just identify that. And then finally, there's often a sense that systemic corruption is a kind of corruption that's been normalized, where the general population, as well as people who are part of the state, just believe that it has been and always will be, right? And that then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the first step in the paper was just to parse out those different ways in which the term systemic corruption is used. Sometimes they all coincide, but they are conceptually distinct. And then the next step is to suggest, well, if that's what we mean, or if those are the meanings we assign to the term, then it actually is plausible to think that law can make a difference. Sometimes the legal response will have to be a big push simply because it's so widespread, you just need a lot more resources. That's the solution. Sometimes it will involve institutional multiplicity, which is particularly useful in situations where you've got the subversive kind of corruption, where so the guardians can control one another. And it may also involve a certain form of political engagement to win over the hearts and minds of the population in the situations where it's become normalized. And so those are all legal strategies, or strategies that legal institutions can pursue, and they're linked to the type of or the form of systemic corruption that you're confronting. So I think part of the paper was just designed to push back against the pessimistic view, which suggests systemic corruption is just a unitary phenomenon that's completely irresistible, and sort of suggest, well, if it's this, then there is this kind of legal response, etc. And then at the back end, and maybe we can come back to this, I did talk about some of the costs and benefits, right, which Kaya also alluded to, and especially
Kevin, I think we lost you on the cost and benefits.
Is involved. And so those are some of the issues that I also at least tried to flag going forward. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Just to alert you, Kevin, we lost you a little bit on the cost and benefits. So when I come back to you, maybe you can restate that at the beginning of your answer to the next question. But thank you for that. And it's great to hear that lawyers have a role to play. We're all here as lawyers delighted to hear that, I'm sure. But I think your paper is great in terms of giving a lot of more conceptual precision to a debate that sometimes is murky and people are talking about different things without realizing. So, again, another piece highly recommended for reading. Okay, I'm going to turn now to Raquel Pimenta.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this first roundtable. I'm also eager to hear you as one of the authors in the next roundtable that will start in a moment. I want also to thank the Revista Direito GV and the UTLJ, which have both published this wonderful those two pieces of incredible research, and thank all the authors that are here today for contributing to this project. And so I had the privilege of co-authoring 2 papers for the special issues. And I will start by picking up on something that Caio just said. So Caio mentioned, and in his very rich description of the multi-layered enforcement that happened in car wash, is something that Mariana and I, on the paper we wrote, published at the UTLJ, were particularly interested in. He, Caio, and his co-author, as well as Vivian, we'll talk in 1 second, they describe all sorts of problems with the multi-layered actions of law enforcement agents. And in a sense, they praise solutions as coordination or the reducing of overlaps, which Caio just mentioned. Mariana and I, on our paper, we challenge the idea that the actions of multiple enforcement agencies trying to tame systemic corruption will inevitably lead to worse outcomes. This paper, of course, draws on a series of studies that Mariana has been particularly spearheading and particularly interested in on institutional multiplicity, but looks at the specific trade-offs of using institutional multiplicity in scenarios of systemic corruption. In order to do so, and very much inspired by the same exercise that Kevin does, but in different directions, we take a granular view of what systemic corruption means. We assume that functional accountability institutions can exist even in dysfunctional overall environments in societies. So if these pockets of excellence, or if these pockets of honesty, as we call it, may exist in corrupt environments, then institutional multiplicity becomes an influence because it may offer to an alternative path to accountability for an individual who is immersed in the systemic corruption environment, but has information about some of the wrongdoing, either because he can be a whistleblower or a potential defendant and wants to bring this forward to authorities, but finds himself or herself on a blockage. So finding an institution that is blocked for accountability, multiplicity offers this individual the possibility to bypass these blockages. However, we do not disregard at all that multiplicity, institutional multiplicity, can be used to undermine the effectiveness of the accountability systems, especially if the accountability institutions are themselves subverted, to use one of Kevin's definitions of systemic corruption. Then coordination might be a better option. And we try to illustrate these 2 scenarios using some examples, some Brazilian examples that are interesting, and I think in the end we're reflecting on the trade-offs on those institutional arrangements. So between coordination, institutional multiplicity, or centralization in the specific context of systemic corruption. So while this first paper with Mariana focuses on the domestic sphere, systemic corruption, we cannot forget, is also a transnational problem. And multiple jurisdictions are either affected by corruption or involved in the efforts to sanction it. Lava Jato car wash is once again another good example of how this is such a transnational problem. Take the Odebrecht case, which might be familiar to most of the people in our audience. Systemic corruption here crosses the borders of 12 other countries, or 11 other countries that the company admitted wrongdoings. It involves multiple layers of money laundering and strong patterns of international cooperation between authorities to sanction all of these wrongdoings. So the second paper I wrote for the project, together with Otávio Venturini, a PhD student from our school, discusses the intricacies of international cooperation between authorities that are looking to sanction wrongdoings. So authorities in different countries, they are incentivized to cooperate with one another, either because the problems cross their borders, either because the conventions that the countries signed to say encourages them to do so, or because their domestic law have some sort of transnational reach that begs for more cooperation. But international cooperation can mean different things. And our paper first starts by unpacking different types of cooperation, different modes of cooperation. So we separate them between investigative cooperation, which allows foreign authorities to assist one another on criminal or civil investigations, sanction-based cooperation, which different authorities assist one another to transfer or extradite persons and recover proceeds of corruptions to the victims. And more recently, and here we discuss in greater length, there has been a rise of a third type of cooperation, which is authorities cooperating to negotiate settlements with the accused, especially with corporations. So we used the Odebrecht case in a few selected countries to show how these three modes of cooperation intersect. We look at the groundbreaking joint resolution between Odebrecht, Brazil, Switzerland, and the US, as well as the two local agreements that the company signed with the Dominican Republic and Peru. We show that the joint resolutions signed between the US, Brazil, and Switzerland are built upon many rounds of formal and informal cooperation between the agencies. However, we also show that these initial joint resolutions end up affecting subsequent cooperation, not only between these authorities, the US, Brazil, and Switzerland, that sat down at the table and negotiated this first set of joint resolutions, but also shapes the negotiation and the cooperation with authorities from different countries that were not included in this first round of negotiations. So the case of Dominican Republic and Peru. So beyond illustrating different types of cooperation, modes of international cooperation, we also explore how they intersect, how they become complex, and how the sequencing of these settlements also affect cooperation in the long run. So I'll stop here for my first intervention. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you, Raquel, and thank you for making my job easy in the next panel by already introducing our paper. And I think, again, I failed to mention in my opening remarks as chair that the entire project was coordinated by Kevin Davis, Raquel Pimenta, Marta Machado, who will be in the next panel, and myself. So we acted as editors of both special issues of the journals as well as authors. As Raquel mentioned, institutional multiplicity plays an important role in the project, but I just want to clarify that I cannot take credit for the concept. Kevin Davis and Mayra Machado here from FGV have spearheaded the concept. I think I just became fascinated with it and have been exploring it since then. So let me turn to Vincent for him to address the two questions that I posed. Vincent, please.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you again to the organizers for including me in the project, in the published project, and also today. I'm very, very grateful. And I should say at the outset that again, or say again maybe, that I'm a bit of an outsider to this field. So if I say anything stupid, that's the reason, or that's what I'm going to blame it on this time. But also just for some context, I guess, for my remarks. But I guess so. I think that my paper focused on the potential for criminal law intervention, so investigations, prosecutions, punishment in helping to curb systemic corruption. And I guess my view about this is somewhat in the middle, in the sense that I think criminal law contributions have an essential role to play, but a modest role to play. So somewhat, I would say essential because the criminal law has a high symbolic valence, high symbolic salience, social salience. And I think it can have a role in anchoring reciprocal expectations of honesty and fair dealing. So if there's a latent social norm, it can have a role in indicating or signaling that norm. But I think its role is also modest because if there isn't such a norm, the kind of deterrent function of the criminal law, I think, is likely to be somewhat insufficient in a high corruption context. So just in that sense, so I think the criminal law interventions can be a kind of a sign, a signal of a shift in social norms. So if you have a high corruption equilibrium and you're trying to move to a lower corruption equilibrium, the criminal law interventions, for instance, through a criminalizing conduct that wasn't previously criminalized, or a large prosecutorial effort or something like that, can be a sign of a shift in norms, but it's crucial that that sign be credible. And so the credibility of the justice system is a very, very important social good on this analysis. And I think the kind of optimistic view is that tendency can, in theory, become self-sustaining insofar as the population you're trying to address are people who are responsive to social norms. So as more people start conforming, that tendency can start to gain steam, a snowball effect, in theory. Deterrence, on the other hand, I think has kind of the opposite logic, for the simple reason that if you start to see more people breaking the law with impunity, that lowers the expected value of punishment. And so the deterrent signal from the criminal law becomes much weaker in that context. So I think you have these two kinds of tendencies that can go either way, depending on what the prevalence of social norms are in the background culture. So I think the kind of more one of the takeaways I kind of defend in the paper is the idea that is, as I said, the criminal law interventions may be effective, but only when used against the backdrop of norms where people are inclined to regard the signals from the justice system as credible. So I really emphasize the importance of really preserving, I think, is a very, very precious good, public good, the public perception of legitimacy in the legal process. But ultimately, I think that my view is, I guess, somewhat in the middle in terms of referring to Kevin's earlier remarks about I'm not entirely skeptical about the possibility of law contributing to changing a high corruption norm, but I'm also not. I think, as Mariana put it, I'm skeptical of a silver bullet here. So I guess I'll stop there.
That's great, Vincent. Thank you. And thank you again for accepting our invitation. I think we need, it's always good to have a fresh pair of eyes looking at a topic that some people have been immersed for years, because you can spot things, as you did in your paper, that other people may have failed to have spotted. And I think, as you just suggested, most of the answers in these special issues is it depends, right? Institutional multiplicity, does it help? It depends. Criminal law, does it help? It depends. Even Kevin's piece, does law help? It depends. Again, I'm going to recommend everybody to read the pieces. And failing again as a moderator, I failed to announce, if you have questions as audience, there is a link to Slido at the bottom of the YouTube screening. You can click there and send us questions, which I'm going to convey to the panelists once we finish the second round of questions. So last but not least, Vivian, please.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank everyone. I would like to thank especially FGV and especially all the organizers, Mariana, Kevin, Raquel, and Marta, for inviting me to be part of this project. We had fascinating discussions and a real good exchange of ideas, and the 2 published volumes are really very interesting and worth reading. So just trying to quickly answer Mariana's questions. As a last speaker, I feel like a lot of things that I would like to say have been said, but my take on anti-corruption law for the piece I wrote for the project was also focused on institutional multiplicity, but instead of discussing how different agencies perform accountability functions, I discussed how courts and lawyers have interpreted a statute that tried to create multiplicity in Brazil, which was the Administrative Improbity Act. So the law was basically an attempt to improve the effectiveness of the struggle against corruption in Brazil by means of enhancing institutional multiplicity. So you had criminal liability, you had civil liability, you have administrative liability, and now from 1992 onwards, we also had administrative improbity. The problem is, as previous research showed, cases have accumulated and often taken several years before reaching conclusion. And recovery of assets also has not been substantial. So my main argument was, well, in the face of a very complex political institutional reality, the strategy of establishing a new law to promote institutional multiplicity seems to have backfired. And my paper focuses on a topic that has occupied Brazilian courts for a very long time, which is determining where should politicians be tried for these cases. The law does not establish exactly what jurisdiction, the jurisdiction in which these cases should be filed and tried, and this has encouraged politicians to raise arguments of procedural fairness. There are basically 2 arguments being raised. First, could politicians be tried before the judiciary, since they were already subject to accountability before the legislative? Does it violate the non bis in idem principle? And secondly, could these trials take place in lower courts, in an atmosphere which was potentially politically charged, or should these cases be referred to the Supreme Court? So politicians were demanding that they should be tried before the Supreme Court or even the legislative branch. Such discussions ended up avoiding, or at least postponing, discussing the actual problem, which was their behavior. And truth is that once confronted with such procedural fairness issues, Brazilian courts have been debating for years how to interpret the Administrative Improbity Act, considering other existing systems of responsibility. Basically, what I did was I analyzed Supreme Court's most important decisions on the topic, and I concluded that, well, there was a poor legal design problem. The law did not address a series of problems that it would create, but also there was a very big legal implementation problem. It took more than 10 years for the Supreme Court and the Superior Court of Justice to finally decide that, first, that administrative improbity cases can run parallel to other accountability process, and secondly, that the procedure provided for in Administrative Improbity Act is not criminal, and then referring cases to lower court. Such long debate has led to legal uncertainty, to legal uncertainty, and individual cases were ended up being decided differently. One problem was obviously the absence of a strong precedent system. But also another problem was that courts have dealt with the matter in a very unpragmatic way, very theoretical. They approached the matter in a quite formalistic way. They framed the problem as defining whether the law should be considered civil, criminal, or administrative, so they could decide on the procedural safeguards that were applicable to such cases. It was a real quest for the legal nature of the liability regime. And all of these opened an avenue for legal uncertainty that has ultimately undermined the effectiveness of the legal system. Trying to answer the question in very short words, I think basically my paper shows that law may fail in that quest. And over the years, legal mechanisms that in theory could work well may face difficulties, especially because political and institutional reality is quite messy and quite complex. But I'm a strong believer that rich empirical analysis can contribute for us to develop context-specific knowledge about potential and limits of these legal instruments in our anti-corruption efforts. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And as everybody can see, the project goes from very high-level discussions, does criminal law deter people from acting, to very detailed discussions, like once you're trying to create institutional multiplicity, what are the problems you might confront? And I think Vivian's paper provides a very rich analysis of some of the concrete challenges you may face once you create these new laws, which I think it provides a panoply of questions that reformers need to address, going from the larger questions to the very detailed issues of institutional design. So thank you. Let me turn to my second question, and just to alert the audience, after that, I'm going to be taking questions from you. So please use the Slido to send us your questions. But this is my second question to the panel. What's next? We have done this project, we have identified issues, we have create conceptual precision, we have analyzed how solutions work or might not work. What do you think is the next thing that some of the literature on corruption should be turning to? And I'm going to follow the same order, so let's go back to Caio.
Thank you, Mariana. I think it's fascinating to listen to the other authors, and I think we had very quality interaction throughout the project, but it's always fascinating to see all this together and the different pieces and bits of this conundrum where I think the two volumes really help to eliminate. So I think as any large research project as this one and ambitious as this one, I think it contributes to understanding the problem, but opens lots of new roads as well. And I think that's where we are here. At least that's my feeling. And in listening to all of you, it's just reinforced by that. So I think one first thing that I think is quite important is to keep trying to have a deeper understanding of systemic corruption. This is an incredibly complex problem, and just tackling the problem, just describing what's happened, describing large efforts like car wash in Brazil, but that actually happened elsewhere as well. Just trying to understand that, and that's like, I think that's the minor contribution of my paper with Alison, but still, it's just such a difficult issue to tackle, just to understand how big it was, what are the different layers, how it happened. So if you can have more of that, more understanding of where systemic corruption took place, what actually happened, how enforcement worked, what didn't work. I think that in a very descriptive level is very helpful, and I think we need more of that. We don't have enough of this detailed understanding of how systemic corruption has made it works through in different contexts, different jurisdictions, different types of enforcement there. So I think that's one thing that I believe that this project contributes as doing a big effort on that, especially inspired by car wash, but not only by car wash. But I think it shines light to other projects that can do that further. So I think that's one level. The second level that I think has been already touched upon by many of the authors here is really about institutional multiplicity. I think that's a key issue. I think when we look at the large problem like this, it's impossible to deal with a systemic corruption without thinking about multiple institutions that are going to have different functions here. And the question about, which is the question that I think Raquel raised in her comments, and Vivian to a certain extent, but I think all the authors at some point touch upon this in deeper context or not, is really about what's the optimal level of institutional multiplicity, of coordination, of overlaps, of potential bypasses. And this is going to be very contextual. This is going to be very context specific, right? I mean, it will depend on what's going on. And understanding this and understanding that sometimes overlapping is too much. Sometimes bypassing is essential. Sometimes coordination is going to be important to reach a new level of efficiency and enforcement. I think understanding these different types of arrangements and how we can calibrate those, I think that's going to be particularly important. And shining light to this, I think this project helps a lot, but opens a lot of new avenues in trying to look at this. I think it's really, to my knowledge, one of the projects that really looked at this issue of institutional multiplicity from many different levels and many different directions. And I think it opens new issues for further research that we need to look at. And I think that's incredibly interesting field of research that we can move forward here. Then just a couple last comments. One is about evaluating reforms, right? I mean, I think many of us inspired by this project, we're thinking about reforms. What types of reforms are needed? What reforms could be imagined to help solving the problem, or at least helping making a better environment where corruption would not reach this vicious circle that we saw not only in Brazil, but in other jurisdictions as well, but could move to a different equilibrium, right? So evaluating reforms, testing reforms, imagining reforms. I think that's really a field where we need more, not only investigation, but real policy experimentation. I think that's really what we should be looking at regarding reforms. And finally, I think the articles regarding political and constitutional implications of systemic corruption, like Paul Lagunes and Oscar Villena, I think they're going to be both in the next panel. I think these other issues, I mean, these different layers of discussions of how systemic corruption can be tackled by or affect different layers of the political system or of the constitutional framework, I think that's extremely interesting as well. I mean, understanding that systemic corruption is not just a crime or just wrongdoing, it's something that's affecting institutions in a much deeper level. And understanding that those levels and understanding how to tackle that, I think that really opens a new road for discussions as well. That doesn't underestimate the problem. I mean, it's not about just fighting the bad guys. It's about discussing the institutional framework as a whole and how it's affected and how it can be changed to make a better environment. So let me pause here, but I think there are many new roads that are being opened. As much as I can understand that this project contributes a lot to the issue, it opens new subjects that I think are going to be quite useful and interesting to pursue.
Thank you, Caio. Kevin.
Well, rather than sort of restate what Caio said, I guess I just want to highlight how difficult it will be to pursue the kind of research agenda that he just described, because he's suggesting that not only should we be trying to understand the benefits of anti-corruption law, right, but also some of the costs of new initiatives. So not just the direct costs in terms of resources, but also the impact on the economy. And this is something that those of you in Brazil, I think, will be very conscious of, but also in all the other countries that were affected by Odebrecht, some of the Odebrecht cases, some of the estimates of the impacts on economic growth and unemployment are really quite staggering in countries like Peru and well, Venezuela as well. And those are, in the Venezuelan case, those are countries that are already struggling. So we have to think about those kinds of economic costs, the effects on the political system. I mean, just again, to Peru, the last 5 presidents are implicated in Odebrecht. That's an enormous impact from just a single case. And then, of course, the due process issues. This may be where I froze the last time. I was saying, well, you have to pay attention to some of these concerns that we have about the impact on due process of some of the innovations in car wash. And the legitimacy, the accountability. So it's really a multi-layered analytical framework that will have to be deployed, and that's challenging. It's much easier just to say, okay, does it work and does it not work? One would think, but then even if we limited the focus to the does it work question, the other paper I have in this collection in the UTLJ in the University of Toronto Law Journal actually is designed to sort of highlight the challenges with figuring out, does it work or did it work and will it work somewhere else? Kai already mentioned the challenges in terms of collecting data and the work that he and Allison did to figure out just what was done, what happened in car wash. That was an enormous exercise. It's actually quite difficult to collect data on enforcement initiatives, much less the other side of the equation, which is, well, what was the impact, right? Because if you want to figure out what worked, you need to figure out not only what was done, but what was the effect, what were the outcomes. Corruption is difficult to observe. We don't actually know how much bribery is going on in Brazilian procurement right now. And trying to do a better job of getting a handle on that is one of the big challenges for the field, as is drawing the causal connection between what's been done and the outcomes that whatever outcomes you manage to observe, especially in context of institutional multiplicity, where you don't know whether any changes in behavior are attributable to what the Ministerio Público has done, what CAGI has done, what the U.S. Department of Justice has done, maybe it's U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, CVM, whatever. It's hard to isolate the effects of individual initiatives in this context where you've got overlapping enforcement. And then, of course, you need to figure out what happened in the past, figure out whether it's likely to happen in the future. Will past results reflect future performance? Who knows? So the generalizability question. And then lastly, something else I do want to underscore, which comes up in Kaio and Allison's paper as well, having officials with the capacity, with the skills required to conduct these kinds of analyses is actually something that you can't take for granted. Brazil is exceptional in many ways, and given the caliber of its of the public officials across a range of agencies, but that's not necessarily the case in other jurisdictions that are affected by corruption. So I think one of the challenges for the future of pursuing this research agenda is simply going to be finding people who are capable of pursuing it, given all of the difficulties inherent in it. So that's my, I guess, take on the future. Lots of work to be done, but it's going to be difficult.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope Raquel can take us on a more optimistic direction, perhaps.
Not sure, but let me just restate something that was already said. And now talking about specifically the Brazilian context, sometimes we get a certain fatigue of the car wash case. We have the impression that everything has already been said about this case, and I really should think we should hold back on that assumption. I think there's still a lot of descriptive cases that need to be further mapped and reflected upon, although this effort, this 2-year project, is already showing how valuable it is, Caio's papers, Vivian's papers, other papers, to take on this this task of really doing the empirical work on car wash and in other investigations. I want to actually just highlight again the importance of the transnational arena for systemic corruption and for the anti-corruption efforts. I think Kevin already mentioned how other countries are affected by the actions of enforcement agencies in different ones. Well, the FCPA is a major case in that sense, and we have a paper from Professor Acorn only talking about FCPA, which should be certainly of interest for some of us. But I also wanted to highlight one thing that I think it's interesting to look at. So the problems of institutional multiplicity in the domestic arena are somewhat, they can also be found in the international arena, right? The overlaps between jurisdictions and how to determine. And of course, then the international arena will have specificities like sovereignty, concerns of sovereignty and legitimacy and capacities, as Kevin mentioned, the different capacities between agencies in different countries. But again, I think one interesting research agenda would be to look at, in parallel, the lessons we can possibly learn from the domestic agenda, the domestic sphere and the international sphere, and not treat them so much as separate problems. Maybe this is something that interests me, and I think it would be interesting pursuing forward. And I also wanted to highlight here the importance on these new mechanisms that we found on car wash, but actually are proliferating in all over the world, such as settlements and non-trial agreements in general with individuals and especially with corporations. I think there's a lot of work to be done on how what is the effective and legitimate concerns regarding these agreements. I think this is a field that is blooming, but there's still quite a lot to be further researched on. And I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Raquel. Vincent.
So again, with the caveat that not being a specialist in this area, so I don't want to pretend like I have a comprehensive sense of the existing literature, which is obviously vast. I mean, I think from my point of view, I think of the research agenda that I think is particularly interesting for a legal theorist is sort of what you might think of as a theoretical sociology of law and of norm compliance. And so I think what I have in mind here is trying to develop a better theoretical understanding of what motivates norm compliance, including formal norms such as legal norms, but also informal norms, criminal law norms of a wide variety. So I think the corruption, from a criminal lawyer's point of view, corruption is a type of crime, but it's not the only type of crime for which social norms would plausibly have a significant impact. And so that's one dimension of it. Another dimension is sort of looking at theoretical sociology, not so much of individuals and how they behave, but a theoretical sociology of institutions and how they behave. In trying to get it. So this goes to some of what's been discussed before about the optimal degree of multiplicity, if there is such a thing as an optimal degree here. But also, I think in the last few years, corruption aside, we've seen many issues arise with our institutions in many countries in response to the global pandemic and various other global problems. And so I think it might be interesting to think about corruption as one type of ailment that institutions, public institutions, seem to be susceptible to. Others, including capture, stasis, refusing to change, adapt, these types of things. So having a broader theory of institutions would be the next item. And the last thing I would say is sort of we've been focusing, I think, on what I think of as sort of the dynamics of corruption in the sense of reform efforts. If you're in a high corruption equilibrium, what kind of causal models can we develop that will help us predict what will get us out of that equilibrium? But it seems also very important to have a causal theory on the on-ramp to high corruption, sort of getting modeled. What are the dynamics that lead to a kind of condition of high levels of systemic corruption as well? And, obviously there is work in this field, so I'm not just. I think that's an area that seems particularly important.
That's great. Thank you, Vincent. And for our viewers, there was a cameo appearance of Marta Machado, who is the 4th editor of this project. So that was her showing her face here briefly. Let me turn to Vivian, and before we open the questions to the audience.
Okay, so being last again, I think much of what I wanted to say has been said. I think Caio advanced many of the things that I also believe would be interesting to see unfold and to look at. But drawing a little bit on what Raquel said about, us Brazilians having some kind of fatigue over the car wash operation, I think it's natural. But I think we need to also keep on the perspective that it's all very recent, all very overwhelming. And I think we should, results on this field will take time. And I think, historical distance will do us good. And we should, I really believe that, there is a lot of complex, difficult issues that have been arising, and reading all these papers, we can just see them popping up. Well, there's something to look at in here. There's something in here that we should look at. And I think, basically what we need is more volume of research, more work, more papers, more work to be done, and to really look at this context, the specific issues. I think the more work we have, then with a little bit more distance, we can look at it and, draw answers. I think right now, I believe for the future, we need to, continue and, just hope that in the future, we will look back and we'll find very good answers. But I do believe context specific and rich empirical analysis are a very good way, a very good investment to make right now. And on the theoretical level, I believe Kevin pointed out, I think what I think is very interesting to look at is how we assess, how we evaluate responses to systemic corruption. And we tend to evaluate them on the grounds of effectiveness. And I think many other papers in the issue show that we also need to look at due process, rule of law, legitimacy, procedural fairness, efficiency, political implications. So I think that's also very interesting, I think, on the theoretical level for us to try and look at.
That's great, Vivian. Thank you. And I think this collection of comments about what's next is setting the stage for all the people in our audience who are starting graduate students in the master's program, in the doctoral program. So as you can see, there is a number of the challenges that Kevin identified by saying these are challenges that maybe you can resolve on your master thesis or address on your doctoral dissertation. But basically, they're challenges at the conceptual level, theoretical level, normative level, and as Vivian, I think, nicely put at the end, and there are rich case studies to be done, Lava Jato being potentially one of the richest available today. So thank you all for this. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. I do not have the name of the person, but this person is saying, I'm very happy to listen to scholars that we admire so much in an event, in this event. And this person is saying, I think the question of corruption in Brazil is often treated as a Brazilian problem. So maybe I will turn this into a question and say, is this true? I think that's a descriptive question. And second, if it is, as scholars, how can we deal with that? So I'm just going to open the floor. Not everybody may have comments about this. So I'm just going to get perhaps a couple of comments before I move on to the next question.
I can start. I think, well, I think we have highlighting here this the idea that corruption is context specific. So yes, I think no one would disagree that this is a Brazilian problem. And Caio's paper, Vivian's papers, we all show how particular features of the legal system matters not only for how corruption itself takes place, but also how anti-corruption efforts develop. So yes, it is a Brazilian problem, but of course, maybe the question has this idea that it's not only a Brazilian problem, and I think it's a problem throughout the world. I think there is a rich literature on different types of corruption or syndromes of corruption, to use one work of political science, Johnson. So that wealth and political power, they tend to combine in different ways in different countries. But and yes, and that means, of course, we need to pay attention to what's happening elsewhere, not only because it affects what happens here, as we all know, and I mentioned several times, car wash was a very an investigation that had a lot of international components, but also we can learn from what happened in other jurisdictions, with the given caveats, of course. So more comparative research on anti-corruption is probably a very prominent research agenda.
Can I just jump in?
Sure.
Sure. Just to say, I think one of the ironies of anti-corruption law is that the more corruption you detect, the more people think there is. So I think the very success of car wash is what has contributed to the impression that corruption is a distinctly Brazilian problem. But of course, when you look at the Odebrecht cases, well, it's clearly a problem in a whole bunch of other countries as well. Sitting in New York, I'm actually not accustomed to this idea that corruption is uniquely Brazilian. What I do see, though, is the sense that corruption is peculiarly a problem of developing countries, and it's not a problem in rich countries. And so I often have to push back against that with my students and show them pictures of all the Illinois governors and representatives, state of Illinois in the United States, who've been indicted, convicted for corruption, or the times when there will be sweeps and, scores of mayors in New Jersey will be swept up in corruption stings. So no, it's an issue. It's not unique to Brazil. It's not even unique to developing countries by any means.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to turn to Caio and Vivian in a minute, but I just want to add something to that. Canada has its own version of the car wash, which was investigated by the Charbonneau Commission, but it was a construction cartel, again, rigging, procurement processes, with the added twist that they hired or they associated themselves with the Hells Angels, a criminal organization, to actually coerce competitors out of the market. So if there is a scandal that deserves a Netflix series, I think it's the one investigated by the Charbonneau Commission in Quebec. So Caio, I think the order I saw the hands is Caio and then Vivian, please.
I thought it was the other way around. So if you want to pick it first, Vivian, feel free. Okay. So very, very quickly, I think what is implied in the question is that somehow when we think about corruption in Brazil, that there would be this problem of origin, right? I mean, so it would be somehow culturally connected. And I think part of the big effort of this project, although inspired in car wash, is really an institutional take over this problem, right? I mean, I think what's a common perspective of all authors in this project is really understanding corruption not as something that's identified with the culture of a particular place, but that emerges and thrives and can be fought from an institutional perspective. And I think that's really part of the contribution of this project, which makes, of course, this is very context specific at an institutional level as well, but it's not culturally specific. And I think that's really a major contribution of the project. Said that, I fully agree with Kevin and Raquel and Mariana about how comparative work in this field is incredibly important, right? Understanding the different contexts and also trying to draw lessons from different contexts, but that can be used in other contexts and in other countries. I think those are challenges that are still ahead of us and that we still need to deepen this discussion further. So that's my reaction to the question.
Thank you, Caio. Vivian.
I just wanted to point out that I think the idea of a problem of origin, a problem that the notion that Brazilian culture is particularly corrupt is very embedded in Brazilian sociological work. And we read that, everybody reads that, and we were raised in that culture. So I think that has also to do with why we look at car wash and think it's a Brazilian problem. And I think that's very important and very useful to use cases and compare cases and say, okay, this happens also in Canada, this can happen in Germany. It's not like there's a superior culture that is not corrupt in anywhere. It's like an institutional problem. So just, I agree with Caio what just said, and I think the idea that is an original problem has been consolidated throughout several years in our, sociological culture.
Just to add one thing, Mariana, if you allow me 30 seconds, it's said that I think we have an amazing opportunity with car wash. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of stories, particular cases. And I agree with Raquel here, although it generates fatigue. I mean, all of us are kind of like tired of hearing of car wash. It also all the backlashes of car wash, right? I mean, we all agree that there are problems with car wash as well. But the issue is, it's hard to see such a deep a problem with a picture that is as rich as we can see in Brazil. So this is a lot of material and a lot of data for research. So we need to look at that, and we can't diminish how important this is for understanding the problem and tackling it.
Okay, we have another question here coming about the press. Do you believe that the press, as the fourth power, has a central role in constraining corruption by exposing suspicious acts of public officials? We do not have a lot of time, like 5 more minutes, but I will again open the floor to whoever wants to chime in.
Well, I could just say, I mean, I think the role of the media here is a little bit ambiguous, and in my view, because there is a role in, I would think in publicizing a vigorous kind of public norm, so publicly held social norms, or sending messages. Many people in society regard this behavior as contemptible and so forth. But the ambiguity, I think, is just as Kevin was pointing out, it can also have the opposite effect, normalizing corruption by saying, oh, well, it turns out, look, see, lots of people are doing this. So I think there's a very fine line here in terms of how exactly what exactly the media's role, but that they have a role, I think, I would say that they certainly do.
Thank you, Vincent. And if I can just press you, Vincent, if you don't mind, the previous question was also touching upon something you mentioned, right? Which is the role of informal rules and norms. I'm wondering, how do you see this discourse of the problem of origin? I think how we describe it in Brazil, which is this is innate in our nature, right? Versus a more perhaps optimistic approach to informal norms, which is something that's malleable and can be changed. So how, since you raised informal norms as one of the topics that needs to be further explored, does this distinction make sense, and how do you see the possibility of exploring it further?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do think that I mean, in some ways, sitting here in Boston, it would be great if corruption was limited to one country, because then it would be much easier to deal with. But it does seem to be something much much broader than that. And so there does seem to be, so there's, I mean, I don't mean this is just informal norms are the only answer. I mean, institutional design is obviously very clearly important here. But I guess for me, the important concept here is the equilibrium concept, in that different societies can support many different norms. That's all. We can have a whole range of different norms, but any one norm might come to predominate at a particular place at a particular time, and that norm may have antisocial kind of consequences. And so it's really the transition from one equilibrium to the other, from where you have a very stable concept where it's hard to get any actor to kind of move in an effective way. That strikes me as the really hard part. So I wouldn't think that you have kind of entrenched corruption in any particular place. There's anything very deep about that place, and that's about the people in that place. And so it's just you get stuck in a local equilibrium, and how you can get out of that is, hard.
Thank you. Which is a form of institutional thinking again, right? It's just being attentive to the informal rules and norms as well. Anybody else has comments on the press? I may just make a plug for Paul Lagoon's published edited volume about the car wash, which has 2 chapters about the role that the press has played in this particular case. And I would say it's not very complimentary of the role of the press, because I think some of the assessment is that the press was highly acritical and haven't take up the role of actually assessing what was being done. They were just voicing whatever it was conveyed to them by the prosecutors and the people pursuing or conducting the Lava Jato case. So I recommend that reading for those interested in seeing more about that. And I think this is basically bringing us to time. So maybe I will just take this opportunity to thank everybody on this panel, not only for taking the time today, some of us very early on, but also especially for your contributions to this project. I personally can say as an editor, I learned so much from all the papers, all the interactions, all the discussions we had. And I am very much looking forward to seeing this agenda being advanced and us having other future opportunities to work together again. So thank you all very much. And for the audience, our next panel is going to be starting in 15 minutes, which is going to be 11 a.m. in Brazil. Yes. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana.
So hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here in the fourth day of our opening week of the academic year at the graduate program on online development of FGV São Paulo. And today we are in the second panel with my dear colleagues. We are in the second panel of this morning, the launch of our special issue, our dossier on law and systemic corruption, partially published in Direito FGV Law Journal and University of Toronto Law Journal. So I'm really happy to be here with my dear friends, Fernanda, Odila, Fernando Limonge, Mariana Prado, Matthew Taylor, and Oscar Vilhena, who are authors of those of papers in the dossier. We had a 2-year project, 2 years of engagement in researching and discussing the role of law and consequences of law enforcement in curbing corruption. Lava Jato was an important part of our debate, being, of course, one of the largest anti-corruption law enforcement action the world has seen, with significant economic, legal and political consequences, not only in Brazil, but also in the region. And last time we met, we were discussing the working papers in the 2020 Congress. And now, and we had, since then, we went through a very rich process of discussing, revising, and engaging in several layers of conversation with your papers and your ideas. As an editor, together with Mariana, Kevin, and Raquel, that was a really enriching process. It was really an honor to delve into your ideas and papers. We really learned a lot. So before I present you, I take the opportunity to give a special thank to both editors of the journal, Catarina Barbieri and David Deisenhaus, who were extremely patient with our timing and rounds of revision. I know it has been an enduring project, and they have been really patient and excellent and supportive, etc. So I'm presenting here in alphabetical order, Fernanda Odila, postdoctoral research fellow of University of Bologna, Fernando Limonge, professor of FGV School of Economy in São Paulo and University of São Paulo, and also a senior research at SEBRAP, Mariana Mota Prado, you know already, professor at University of Toronto, Matthew Taylor, professor at the American University, and Oscar Vilhena, professor and dean of FGV Law School in São Paulo. So I think I will read the statement before, and then I'll turn to put you 3 questions, and then we start a round. So before I forget, I have to read, and I have to warn that all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. I also would like to ask the public to send questions through Slido, which is this button we have just below the video. So please send. We are collecting questions, and we hope you have time to have a rich conversation at the end. As we did in the previous panel, that of course the previous panel was more around legal consequences and the consequences of the legal field, and pay attention to different institutional and legal aspects of anti-corruption efforts and Lava Jato. So this panel is, we have here authors that were more worried with political and democratic and consequences on the political system and democratic governance, but the same questions are also useful for this. We are using the same questions to start this panel. So the general theme of our project is whether and how law can be deployed to curb corruption. So how does your research help us to answer that question? We also would like you to address what are the main takeaways for the debate from your research. And if you have time, so I hope you have time for our next round. So I ask the pathway, but let's start with these two questions. And I give the floor to Fernanda. And I also, I didn't do that at the beginning, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for you all agreeing to be here and spending the morning with us. It's really a precious opportunity for our students and to make public our efforts in this dossier. Thank you so much for the engagement, not only in the whole project, but also in this panel today. So Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me here. First of all, I need to say that the paper I wrote, I didn't wrote it by myself. So it's a kind of a task force led by Paul Agunis, who at the time was at the Columbia University, and now he's at the Georgetown University. Also, we have Gregory Michener from FGV EBAP in Rio, and Breno Pires, who is a former Columbia student and the reporter who discovered the so-called secret budget, the orçamento secreto at the federal level. So there are four of us, a collective work. And to answer you, I guess we can see this paper as a less obvious way to think about systemic corruption, in the sense that we are not strict to the direct impacts of widespread crimes and wrongdoings related to the misuse of power for private benefit, just to stay with the most common definition of corruption. But we try to think different layers and levels that systemic corruption can impact. So what we do in this paper was very straightforward. Basically, we seek to compare President Bolsonaro's campaign's promises to fight corruption with his early actions as president. In short, we hold Bolsonaro accountable for his promises to fight corruption. So you might remember well that he made a number of specific promises on the matter, and we analyzed his first 2 years as a president. So we are not looking at his stronger alliance with the Centrão, or we are not looking at the investigative committee at the Senate that discovered, for example, bribe offers at the Ministry of Health. So we are looking his first 2 years. So basically what we did was we categorized these promises in 4 key topics: transparency, institutions of accountability, merit-based appointments and dismissals. In this case, because he promised to fire anyone in his government involved with corruption and not hire people from the Centrão, for example. And also we looked at relevant legislation because he promised supporting the 10 measures against corruption, supporting bills that would limit the ability of exploring loopholes and multiple appeals to delay justice. And he failed in all of them in the beginning of his government, to be honest. So the paper, we also kind of set the scene because we recognize that Bolsonaro was not the first one in promising fighting corruption. We show some important institutional advances and improvements through the years, and also how this scenario resulted in more scandals emerging. And because this is important to understand why the anti-corruption rhetoric gained force in the last general elections. And still, I think the main takeaway here is that political rhetoric matters, and hypocrisy, however very common among politicians, is in tension with accountability. So we not only provided empirical evidence that shows that months after the 2018 elections, Bolsonaro has failed the anti-corruption mandate he promised and on which he was elected. But I think this discussion of whether the disconnect between what politicians and what they actually deliver is of relevance to the quality of democracy. So we are interested in that. And I guess that's the thing. When we are highlighting the importance of validating not only Bolsonaro, but we can expand that other politicians' words against his actions from an academic perspective with empirical robustness. I guess this is important. And I hope these open new lines of research to, I don't know, at least to create this environment that academics also engage in social accountability, in the sense that to hold politicians accountable, to keep them on track. We've been seeing the media doing that, the opposition doing that, but I think the empirical that academics and the training academics have can be very helpful to hold politicians accountable. So that's it from my part by now.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. I pass right away to Fernando. So 10 minutes over to you, Fernando. Thank you so much.
Hey, good morning to everybody. Thanks, Marta, Kevin, Mariana, and Raquel for inviting me to participate in this project. And I will be very quick and try to be very objective in presenting the main contribution of my paper to this project. And I should say that it was kind of a research going on, and from the paper I presented in the first session to the paper I published, there is a lot of difference that is very much due to the contributions of the organizers that forced me to be clear and to understand what I was trying to say, that I didn't know what I was trying to say, and they forced and were very patient with my hesitations and difficulty to have a real contribution to the project. So my main point, or my or what I tried to do, and I'm not sure that I was able to, is to reconstruct the relationship between the Lava Jato operation, the car wash operation, and the political system. The way car wash conceived the political system, the way car wash understood the political system, the way the political system works, and the way they thought they could contribute to reconstruct the political system, or the way politics works correctly. In doing so, I tried to analyze the members of the Lava Jato operation, members of the judiciary, and members of the public prosecution office as office holders, as members of this political system. So they were interacting with this political system. And from the perspective of the separation of powers doctrine, or the checks and balances doctrine, I should place them or understand their actions as driven by their institutional interests, their political view and the way they thought about their institutions, the place that those institutions should play within the political system. So they had, as any other political actor, any office holder, institutional interest and a political view of the way these powers should relate themselves. And what they were trying to promote, or they were fighting against corruption, but at the same time, they were trying to reinforce the powers of the judiciary and the public prosecution office to control politicians, to have a screening, so to speak, role, to be able to filter the membership of the other two powers. They want to be able to prosecute them with greater efficiency and to play the role of some sort of tribunal, moral, ethical tribunal that would pre-select the members of the political system, or those that run elections and get office through elections. So this distinction is, for me, very important, that there were office holders that get their power through elections, and there are office holders that get their positions through some sort of examination, and exercise their power after obtaining this position. So there is, according to the checks and balance doctrines, they are fighting against each other and forcing their position and reinforcing their position. So I tried to put Lava Jato into this more general perspective. I was not that clear to me that I was doing that as I was writing, and the final version is not that clear that this is my main problem. I came to realize that in revising the paper so many times, but I had to construct a paper that would go through the beginning of Lava Jato, or the conception of the operation, how they conceived their whole in the political system, their relationship with politicians, how did they see politicians as those that get office through elections, and how elections would work according to them, and the role that corruption would play in elections, and the illicit activities, this kind of stuff. So this is more or less my general contribution to the project, to see Lava Jato as part of a political project from the judiciary and the prosecutor office. And as I made my research, and I still working with this subject, I came to realize that this view that we and that we take for granted, that there is something that is maybe called systemic corruption, is something that we have to question, that we have to kind of take a step back and think, do we have, or what they call, because this is a construction of car wash. And I was reading, for instance, all the sentences Sergio Moro wrote to precautionary, to legitimate precautionary detentions. He always cites the state of systemic corruption as a legitimation device to say, so this politician or this public agent should go to prison despite the fact that I don't have proofs, it's not, that I have no evidence that I should have him cautionary imprisonment. Well, because why? They are all criminals, after all, because corruption is systemic. If they are members of the system, so they are corrupt, so they are criminals. And it's very, just to conclude, it's very interesting that this view that corruption is systemic, that there are parts of the system that are uncorruptible, that are not threatened by corruption, namely public office, the prosecution office, and the judiciary. They are not members of the system in this moment. This is not their problem. Why? If it is systemic, it should pick up the whole system. So they see themselves as exogenous actors, capable of imposing their view over the others. So this is, I think, my main contribution to this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando. That's pretty interesting to think about the disputes and uses of systemic corruption. I'm also working with the pre-trials, and I think there is really good questions on how the idea of systemic corruption was used to enhance discretionary powers and etc. So I think it's a really interesting contribution, and I thank you for being all very compliant with the time, so which makes my work very easy here. I pass right now to Mariana.
Okay, hello everybody. So I think, just like Raquel and Kevin mentioned in the previous paper, I, as an editor, also have two contributions here. So maybe I will start with the paper with Marta. This is a paper that we originally published in the American Journal of Comparative Law. So it's the translation that's being included in this project. But I think this paper has a nice connection with this panel, in the sense that we are sort of taking a deep dive in the doctrinal debates that took place during Lava Jato. So there is a lot of legal talk in the paper, so to speak. But I think we make a larger point of indicating how, at the time that the case was ongoing, a lot of the actors conducting the Lava Jato portrayed to the general public that there would be backlash, in part because corruption is systemic. And this conveyed an idea that anybody who spoke against the operation would be a self-interested actor trying to get some kind of benefit out of it. So the idea here is, if a politician is talking against the operation, is because they're feeling threatened. If a law professor is talking against the operation, is probably because he or she has clients that they want to defend. And this, to a certain extent, undermined the possibility of us having a larger conversation about the goals of any kind of criminal action against corruption. Lava Jato was portraying the goal as effectiveness. We need to put as many people as possible in jail in order to curtail what they were presenting as a systemic problem, as Fernando said, right? But I think the paper with Marta, we highlight how there were deep concerns with due process that were being raised in these more legal, technical, doctrinal debates that were muffled because they were just immediately classified as self-interested contributions of some sort. So we try to unpack this a little bit in that paper, and I think that brings the connection with the political debate and also the public dimension of Lava Jato to the fore. The second contribution that I have for this project, Raquel already introduced to you in the previous panel, so I won't repeat that much. But I want to basically pinpoint how it connects with the political dimensions of these efforts to fight corruption. So the second paper is about institutional multiplicity, which basically refers to situations in which you have multiple institutions in the same legal system that have authority to respond to corruption cases. So you can think about administrative mechanisms, criminal mechanisms, civil mechanisms as being parallel systems that can operate simultaneously if wrongdoing is detected. And one of the things that we ask is, well, is this good or bad? So the answer of sometimes it might be good relates to the discourse of when there is systemic corruption, the entire system is captured and won't be able to tackle the problem. So here we're sort of pressing pause on that idea and saying, well, if there is this multiplicity of institutions, is it possible that some of them are not captured? Is it possible that some of them may not be part of the system, and therefore maybe they may be able to act? And I think our first case study, which is related to carne fraca, weak meat, illustrates that by showing that there is an inspector at the Ministry of Agriculture that comes across a large scheme to take bribes from the meat facilities being inspected. And when he tries to report that to the internal system within the ministry, he gets shut down, partly because very high-level officials within the ministry were benefiting from this scheme, right? So this is your traditional systemic corruption story. Well, then what does he do? He gets outside of the administrative accountability system and goes to the police, and there an investigation starts, which it then proceeds to a criminal trial. So this, for us, is quite a helpful illustration that this idea of systemic corruption seems to suggest that it's either everything or nothing, right? And when we're talking about law enforcement institutions, there might be multiple layers and a level of complexity that I think the literature can explore in a little bit more depth. The not so optimistic view that we convey in our second case study is that sometimes this multiplicity can be problematic. So here we analyze Palossi's plea bargain. So here the idea is not you're dealing with multiple systems. The plea bargain is within one system, the criminal justice system. But there was an attempt to negotiate the agreement with the public prosecutor's office, which failed because the public prosecutor's office felt that Palossi wasn't offering enough to justify such an agreement. And then Palossi went to the police and managed to sign an agreement with this other institution. And here we don't have enough to say that there was wrongdoing on the part of the police. But we do raise a series of hypotheses in order to say, well, if we are in a context where corruption is pervasive, concerned about whether law enforcement institutions are captured, to what extent this possibility of shopping for the law enforcement institution that you're going to sign an agreement with can create the risk of what we call facade enforcement. So as Raquel mentioned in the previous panel, our paper says, is institutional multiplicity good or bad? It depends on the number of variables, the context matters here, and I think we are sort of calling for further research on this topic. So maybe I will stop there to let everybody else speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, for talking about 2 papers in 7 minutes. So you were awesome. And I pass the floor to Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Raquel. I have to look at my paper. There's so many organizers. Raquel, Kevin, Mariana, Marta. Really, this has been a wonderful project. It's also really nice to be here with Fernanda and Fernando and Oscar. It's been a long time, so good to see you all. I kind of feel like everything is coming together for me, so I'm going to depart a little bit from what my written comments were for today, because I hear so many things that really fascinate me, and I think we're all talking from the same script at some level. I agree with Fernando that the organizers were very patient with us as we took a flight of fancy and just sort of began to think about checks and balances. And I'm not quite sure what motivated us, but we were bothered by the way in which checks and balances have been depicted, and not just in Brazil, but also, but I think some of the questions came out of the Brazilian case. And there's this assumption that checks and balances are always very effective in fighting corruption. But Luciano, my co-author, who I should have mentioned earlier, Luciano and I really came to the conclusion in the course of writing this that we don't understand very well how checks and balances operate, especially at moments of high interbranch conflict. And when we're talking about corruption, this is a time when checks and balances often work in ways that are not sort of what our textbook social science classes, suggested to us, or at least what our high school classes suggested to us. And so as I think about the question that we were asked to answer today about whether law can be used to fight corruption, I liked the answer that the last panel gave, which is, it depends. And I think that all of us on this panel are talking about the politics of it, and I would argue that it's the politics that creates the dependency. That is, politics is what determines whether law is actually effective in fighting corruption. And so in the paper, we were pushing back against the argument that checks and balances are always and everywhere an effective way to progress. And I use that vague term because a lot of people suggest that they allow us to progress against corruption, but there are also other implicit gains that supposedly come from checks and balances that function. But our argument in the paper is that checks and balances are really only an empty vessel. They're made effective only by hard factors, such as the balance of political forces, and soft factors, such as the adherence of elites to behavioral norms. And so I think that statement that I just made about the hard factors and the soft factors really touches on a lot of what everybody who's spoken before me has talked about. What are the norms that are guiding these agencies or guiding particular branches of government as they begin to tackle corruption? And who is populating those branches of government? And so I guess where I'm departing a little bit from our paper, but as I was hearing everybody speak and reflecting on the question about whether law can be used to fight corruption effectively, I come to the conclusion that politics is king, that politics really drives how law is used, and particularly in checks and balances situations, how law is used. And in most grand corruption scandals, all of the branches of government are involved. Politics is at its peak, and it therefore becomes central to the reach of law. And so there's a famous argument by Michael Johnstone about syndromes of corruption. But I think what, in retrospect, as I reflect on our paper, we're in many ways, Luciano and I, talking about syndromes of accountability. So on the one hand, you have syndromes of corruption, but the way in which these hard and soft factors influence the functioning of checks and balances is really central to the degree to which law has an effect. And so we in the paper use a term called regime ecology, but it's really about three things: capacity, both the laws on the books, but also the capacity of the different bureaucratic agencies that are involved. Secondly, engagement, and here civic engagement, but also the engagement of the media, which we talked about a little bit on the earlier panel. And then third, dominance, and here we're reflecting on not just political dominance, but the relationship between political and economic elites. And so just to give you one example, and I don't want to overstay my welcome here, but you know, if we think about the Brazilian case, our paper is not solely about the Brazilian case, but if you think about the Brazilian case and you begin to look at political and economic dominance, and you look at who populates the branches of government, Fernando made a very good point that the Ministério Público is populated by people who think of themselves as somehow exogenous. And I think you could make the same point about the judiciary. But then when you look at the top of the apex of these structures, they are populated by people who came out of civil service exams, but they are very much, using a wonderful word from Portuguese, embricados, in the coalition or in the political system. I hate to use the word system because of what Fernando said about systemic, but you know, they're very much drawn from the political elite. And when you look at who populated the other branches of government over the course of the past 35 years in Brazil, it's the MDB, much more than the PSDB and the PT. When you look at the leadership of the Senate, you look at the leadership of the Chamber of Deputies, you look at vice presidents who went on to serve as president, and so forth and so on. So we do a little calculation in there about power years, which parties are in power at every moment in time. And I offer that just as an example of regime ecology, this notion that there are syndromes of corruption, but there are also syndromes of accountability that are driven by how you populate the institutions that are imbued with the responsibility to carry out checks and balances. And I think that's really probably how I would answer the question about how law matters. It depends, but it depends almost entirely on politics. So I'll stop there, but thank you. I'm fascinated by what everybody has said, and I hope I made some sense pulling some of this together.
Thank you, Matthew. You know, you were extremely provocative to legal scholars, so I really appreciate that debate. And I was remembering that Matthew is a long time a contributor with our academic community, and I was just remember back in 2000 this conversation. I took part in this conversation because it came before in 2017 in the São Paulo School of Social Science that I organized with Maria Hermínia. And I think we started our conversation on corruption there. And that was more or less the time we started Mariana and I started the research she presented. And I publicly thank Limonge, who was also who read, I think, 2 or 3 versions of that paper. So I think we are that's really interesting to get together again and see what happened since we just started to put our feet in the field. So I now turn to Oscar. We also say Oscar when we talk in English, but Oscar, go ahead, please. You're muted.
Always. Good morning to everyone. It's an immense pleasure to be here. I'm starting to feel a little bit better by hearing Fernando and Matthew saying that they gave a lot of trouble to the editors. And they keep insisting with me that I had something to say about the issue of corruption, which it was not my original aim. And I hear that you also passed through this process. So Fernando and Matthew, thank you for make me feel a little better with the editors. And I really appreciate what Marta, Mariana, but also Raquel and Kevin did, because my original aim was just to try to understand the nature of the crisis that we passed through from 2013 into 2018 from a constitutional perspective. It was a constitutional breakdown, it was a constitutional crisis. What does this word mean? Was something different? In the end, my perception is that we engage in a series of a cyclical retaliation between the institutions, which I call a clash of powers. And the extension of this clash of powers led to a constitutional stress, a constitutional regression in the sense of how the constitutional game was played. So, but this was my original game. And car wash operation was one of the components of this malaise, constitutional malaise, with others. The immense distributional conflict that took place during this period between those who want more tax incentives, exemptions, benefits from the government, and on the other side, the social welfare that President Dilma had to cope with. So how this was solved? This was an immense important element on the crisis. The fragmentation of the political system, the cost of governing, another element. So car wash was the third element on this. However, these two fantastic scholars said, no, you have to give attention and bring light to one specific element, which was the car wash. So this was not my original intention, but I was led by them, and I'm glad that I tried to do it. So I don't know if I can give any contribution to the debate, but just I'm making this statement to say that was not my original intention. So after being convinced by her, what I try to do is to understand the nature of this clash of powers. I think I agree with both Fernando and Matthew that those inhabitants of the legal agencies were acting politically. This clash of powers is a clash between political powers, even though these political powers are different. One group of them were elected, another group of them are bureaucrats selected by different ways. But there were distinct dynamics in this clash of powers that are derived from the sources of legitimacy of both groups. My perception is that two phenomena coincided and led us to this clash. One is the weakening of the political system derived from the fragmentation of the political party system. The over-fragmented. The fragmentation was studied by Fernando for decades, but I think what we had after 2005 with a very poisoning decision of the Supreme Court was the incentive for the over-fragmentation of the party system. And this made the cost of holding a coalition much more expensive. And so the coalitions became more heterogeneous and difficult to govern. And sources to finance this coalition became more demanding. And I think Dilma wasn't able to deal with this when the economic crisis arrived. So this is one part, the political system. We can talk about corruption or no corruption, systematic. You can change the word, but the fact is that there was a line of finance moving from the private sector, through the private sector, but from the state to political parties. And this was what was named systematic political corruption. And you had a legal institutions or a legal system that was becoming more empowered over the decades, with more autonomy, both the judiciary and the Ministério Público, and with a lot of autonomy provided by the PT during Márcio Tomás Bastos' administration as Minister of Justice. So the ecosystem, the legal ecosystem became more autonomous. I will never say completely autonomous. I don't believe there is a completely autonomous legal system anywhere. However, it became more autonomous than traditionally it was in Brazil. Okay, you just take the Ministério Público all around the states in Brazil. They never did anything against corruption. They were always co-opted by the political forces. So what we saw at the federal level is that they became more autonomous in the process of the legal battle of interest between these two estamentos that I use very loosely, the stratus that I use very loosely. And the mensalão played an enormous role in the identification of the legal profession with some notion of protection of integrity. So we cannot understand the car wash operation without understanding the role of the mensalão and how it played on the ideas. And Moro was a junior judge on the mensalão case, and that had the frustration of dealing with Banestado and that view from very close the frustration of the Castelo de Areia operation, but also participated in the mensalão, where the Supreme Court, composed by a majority of justices appointed by the PT, was very tough on the corruption scandal. So I think this is one ideological component of this process of autonomization of the legal institution. Second, there was, as a result of the 2013 manifestations on the streets, a response from the Dilma government in terms of strengthening the capacity of the legal institutions to prosecute white-collar crimes. So I don't have how to measure the importance of the introduction of the plea bargaining in the Brazilian system. It was a kind of an atomic bomb that was introduced in many other legal systems. However, to deal with minor crimes, with ordinary crimes, and they were lapidated for decades until they were employed in corruption. In Brazil, was like to introduce a new rule in a World Cup, and with one judge handling the implementation of this new weapon, which is an absolutely powerful weapon in terms of organized crime, and mostly white-collar crime, where the level of criminal ethics is very low. So it's not like the mafia with no one says anything. Is an operation with people are loosely bound to each other and they start to talk. So I think the composition of the weakening of the political system and the strengthening of not just of the identity of the legal agencies, but also the empowering, the real empowerment through the new tools given to the judiciary. This was the major component that made this clash possible and made the judiciary and the prosecutors and the federal police believe in what Fernando said. We are those who handle the morale, and we are able to deal with a political system that is so fragmented, is so weakened by corruption, that we can win this battle against that. Obviously, what we saw during the process was that the Supreme Court didn't do its role well in terms of containing and lapidating the use of these new instruments. On the opposite, the Supreme Court accelerated the process. And then comes a second decision of the Supreme Court. I will not debate the merit of it, but that allowed people to be in prison after a second round of conviction in the second level. So this was a major incentive for people to talk. They said, I will not go through all the system as in the past at my house, but I will be in prison. So after some months in prison, after they've been convicted, after the abusive use of pre-trial detentions, use of coerções, inquisições coercitivas. So all of this that the Supreme Court was in agreement made absolutely create a fantastic incentive for people to talk. And then, yes, what they talk, what they show was a systematic corruption, political corruption. You can name in another way. You can say everything they said was illegal to be asked to them. It's all right. However, there is some demonstrations that the money flow in the directions of parties. I don't know how we should call it, if not political corruption. So I think this is the key components. And if there is any thing that my paper tried to contribute was to detect the nuts and bolts of why the judiciary, being very omissive, the Ministério Público, historically, I'm taking a long period here, became not just able, but eager to confront the political system. I think it was a clash of interest between these groups. And final word, because they didn't understood that they were very instrumentalized by the political system itself. The Lava Jato was not just Moro deciding things, but Moro deciding things with the PSDB really supporting the PSDB that was viewed as a modernized force in the political system, supporting all the actions of the Lava Jato. And members of the Supreme Court view as very liberal, Democrat, committed to constitution, supporting the Lava Jato. So they were instrumentalized by the political system. Their ambition was much higher than their wisdom. So they affect those who supported them. So they start to imprison people from PSDB, people from MDB, people from Centrão. So the system closed against them. So what started with Michel Temer deconstructing the Lava Jato with the agreement of PT ended with the cooptation of Moro to the Bolsonaro government and the sacramentation of the ends of Lava Jato. So the political, I agree with Matthew, the political is king of this, because they instrumentalized the Lava Jato and they put an end to the Lava Jato. Marta, if I can say one more thing, I don't know for how long I've been saying. One of the points put it by Marta and Marianne and Kevin in the end of my paper was, well, there is a paper of Tushnet saying, so law should not enter in this conflicts. Law always destabilizes democracy. Do you think this happened here? I think it is inevitable that when law confronts systematic corruption, it can hurt democracy. I think it is almost inevitable that law enters. It's an impossible question. Law only doesn't enter this field when legal institutions are so weak that they are co-opted by the corruption. When they have a minimum of autonomy, it's impossible for a public prosecutor, for a police officer to start investigation, to promote an investigation. And if you have the tool of plea bargaining, people bring informations, then this grows. And it's impossible in an open society that the media doesn't pressure. And it's impossible that the community doesn't feel threatened by corruption and supportive. So I think there is an inevitability that legal system will enter and legal system will get politicized. The question, and I will not move to this, perhaps if we have a second round, is what are the lessons learned? Is first, what are the incentives, institutional incentives that created the conditions for Fernando cannot call, doesn't want to call systemic corruption, but something that smells bad. And second is how can we deal with the contention of the legal system when it enters in this kind of clash of powers. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Oscar. That's really amazing how Lava Jato puts a new, opens new avenue for us to discuss relation between law and politics and legal enforcement and politics. We were like very comfortable so far, like discussing progressive litigation and advances made by the judiciary. And I think this conversation, Lava Jato really puts new questions to those who research the interactions between the political and the legal system. It's really amazing. And our public is very shy, so we don't have any questions so far. So if you really want to drop a question, don't be shy. And I think we have time for another round. I don't know if you have time for all of us to talk, but if you who has something to say, I would invite you to jump and address this final question, which is a question for the field. So a question for our newcomers students that are just starting their masters and PhDs in this year. And the question is, what's missing from studies on corruption, and what are the promising questions to advance the field? And I would engage you to specifically talk about this connection between law and politics in anti-corruption efforts. So who might want to jump first? I don't want to take the risk to make the round because I'm not sure if you have time. Fernando, go ahead.
Fernando, you want to talk also? So we could follow the round.
I can go very briefly. Yeah, no problem. I go very fast. I've been thinking, from what you said, maybe we need to understand better possible side effects of fighting corruption and exposing corruption no matter what, or even when we have weak checks and balances over the guardians, I would say. So possible ways to think it's if the judiciary or the prosecution service are not held accountable, does it increase tolerance towards corruption? Or does it open room for less democratic regimes? Or does it empower certain elites who are part of the system, but as Fernando said, behave or pretend they are not? So these things are coming to my mind. And also one thing that I've been really thinking about is what makes politicians vote for or not anti-corruption legislation. So if we look at the recent past and think about, I don't know, the bill that criminalized vote buying, the Clean Slate Law, the Ficha Limpa Law, or even the Clean Company Act, they passed under intense popular pressure. And I'm thinking if the role of civil society in these regards, if politicians overall, they resist to pass laws that eventually can be used against themselves or not, and what are the incentives they have to do so. So these are some research questions that pop out of my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are like struggling for having the round, and I think we are okay with that. So Fernando.
Okay, thanks. First, I should recognize that I thanked the editors, and I forgot to thank the members of the seminar, and to say that the things I said, checks and balances, blah, 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 it came from Matthew and Oscar. When I presented my paper, I said, and read their papers, I said, oh, what I'm talking is the same that they are talking, so they are more smart than me. They know that this is constitutional, that there are powers. Oh, yes, good. So I kind of rewrote after reading their papers, and I think that okay, so thanks. Just to polemical or just to provoke, okay? So we say that we have systemic corruption, but this systemic corruption happened to happen only during the PT administration. That was the great magic that car wash played. That at the same time that corruption is systemic, it's only, or it's attached to the two PT administrations or the three PT administrations, as if in the past it was something different. But if it is systemic, it should not be different. And if you read and take seriously their academic production before Lava Jato, all that Moro wrote, all that Dallagnol wrote, they were looking at systemic corruption before the PT administration. So during the car wash, the thing blew in the two PT administration, and they let it, they take advantage of that. They knew that that was giving speed, engine, combust. Let them go with the support of PSDB, etc. But their project was much more ambitious. That is in the original 202 Moro's paper, and in Dallagnol master's dissertation. They wanted power, and they wanted to go against the whole political system. And in this view, their political project was very, very irresponsible, politically irresponsible. They knew they were destroying everything. They knew that from Italy, they were reproducing what Mani Puliti did. They knew they were doing on purpose, and they knew that afterwards, there was no guarantee that the new political system would be better than the previous one. That happened in Italy, and Moro recognizes in his paper. Berlusconi is the main winner of all these things, so corruption is the same. But we will do it anyway. We will do it. It's worth doing. So their connection with the extreme right wing that was outside the mainstream was being built during the whole operation. They were not only very anti-PT, but they were very anti-PSDB also. And who paid the greater price politically was PSDB after the Temer administration, when PSDB supports Temer and supports Aécio. And that killed PSDB. And that elected Bolsonaro, right? So they knew what they were doing. And they were playing for that. They want to destroy the political system because they only could understand the political system as corrupt. So here, I think that Matthew is totally right. Politics is key, is the king. Everybody is playing politics. There's no way of saying that someone is not playing politics in this world. Moreover, if you are an office holder, also, not only for us as analysts, as scientists, then we should be able to detach ourselves and not take sides in this thing and try to explain. And I think that we ourselves engaged too much in this fight against corruption as always a good thing. And so there is something that I call attention in my paper that I think that is not being discussed, that is, there are different ways to fight corruption. And Lava Jato had one proposition, that the best and the only way to fight corruption is to put people in prison, punishment. The cause, the structural cause of corruption is impunity. That's in Dallagnol dissertation, that's in Sergio Moro's paper. If we don't punish, these guys do not have the incentive to behave okay. So we don't look to institutions. We don't look like how bids are made for construction contracts. They are not what we are interested in. What we need is to punish politicians, not entrepreneurs. And if you look at any book on corruption, the definition of corruption only include politicians nowadays. Only politicians can be corrupt. But if you look at Lava Jato, where, Raquel will complain with me, they were punished. Yeah, they were punished, but it was not their main enemies. The enemy were the politicians. And if you look at the textbooks on corruption, politicians is the evil, is the problem. So I think that we have to also, if we're as scholars, not to buy projects of institutional actors playing politics and playing some projects, saying this is the way to fight corruption, and we have to detach ourselves and understand what their projects are and different ways of fighting corruption and different consequences that they have. I think that their view that impunity is the structural cause of corruption is pure nonsense. It's pure nonsense. And it led to a project in which all that interested them was to get plea bargains, to get somebody else. They were climbing the mountain to get to the top. They thought that there was a criminal organization as the mafia, that there is a capo di tutti capi, that if we get this guy, everything will be destroyed. And they didn't look how directors were nominated in Petrobras. They were not interested in that. They were not interested in how bids are made for contracts. Punishment, punishment. And I think this is silly as hell to fight corruption. And if politics...
May I answer? You're being polemical alone. You need someone to discuss with you.
Yes, and we have 3 minutes, please. So I would invite I invite you to jump and make 3 minutes remark before they kill us, because we are expanding our time. So please.
No, just using just 1.5 minutes. No, I fully agree with Fernando with the politicization of Lava Jato, what they done and how they act, and the ideology that moved them. That's not a point of disagreement, Fernando. The point is the political system had faults, and some of the faults made it very fragile and made it a victim of in this process. So part of the debate is not recognizing that the political system had faults. I am agreeing completely with you that there is a major problem in the way the corruption battle was fought by the legal system. But there, in my perspective, I'm not asking you to agree with me, there was a problem in the political system and how political parties were financed and how major constructing companies have access to state funding, to state funds, beneficial access that we call corruption. So this is one point that we have to acknowledge. And this was denounced in the Sarney government, in Collor government. Collor was impeached because of that. Fernando Henrique received at least 50 impeachment petitions. There was a public prosecutor that was his Delanhol, however less competent. So it was not just in the petit. And if we see what happened in Minas Gerais or in Rio de Janeiro, other parties were affected. But my point, and that's why I put so much attention to the 2013 crisis, is that the response of the political system to the crisis that I linked to the unfulfilled promises of the Constitution, it's a larger crisis, was to respond empowering the legal system, giving very potent tools. And that's why I think the narrative of the corruption gained a momentum, is because the Ministério Público had this power, which didn't have before. So I agree with your description, but I'm just saying that we have to watch to what happened before and have to watch what were the problems that generate this absolutely dysfunction political system and corruption in the political system. And then I move to Fernanda. I think the basic problem was the involvement, and this is a design problem, of the Supreme Court in the battle. That's why the Supreme Court cannot play the role of guardianship of the right system, because it was a soldier in the debate. Since the Mensalão, this is one point. Second point, because our system of judges that instruct and trial is a disaster, because they also cannot be limiting themselves, as Moro. Moro is a quintessential example of a judge who became a police officer.
Thank you, Oscar. I will give 2 minutes to Matthew and then pass directly Mariana. You jump. to say last words and say and then we finish. I'm sorry for FGV staff for expanding the time. So Matthew.
I'll be quick. I think I agree, as always with Fernando, I always agree, but just our emphasis is always a little different. But I think your big point that what we need to fight is not actors, but incentives is really central. And that leads to the question of how to fight corruption. I'm not sure I agree with the point that it's not always a good thing. I mean, yes, it's not always a good thing at the extreme, but in general, it's not a bad thing. I guess the question you raise is it through imprisonment or not? And I think that's a very valid question. And probably if we're fighting incentives, the answer is no. That really we need to change the incentives so people aren't corrupt rather than jail people because they became corrupt. And so then the research question is really, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a system in which the incentives are driving people to push back always against change? And I'm afraid, I'm not trying to talk about Brazil, but I think the thing that comes to mind is how much pushback and how much backsliding there has been in Brazil since the heyday of Lava Jato, let's say between 2014 and 2017. Since then, what we've seen is changes in laws, pushback against personnel, changes in directors of the federal police and other agencies. And, this is very natural, as you pointed out. I think Moro himself, if you had asked him in 2002 when he was writing his paper, would have said, yes, this is likely to happen. And he saw that in Italy. And the question I have is why he didn't think that would happen in Brazil, or why he thought it would be acceptable in Brazil. But anyway, I take your central point there, that maybe the way to fight corruption is more incremental and less through the criminal system, criminal justice system.
Okay, and I'm just going to jump right in, Marta, in the interest of time. And I just want to go back to Matthew's very provocative proposition that it all goes back to politics. And I think your response just now told us it doesn't, right? Like politics is determined by how institutions are designed. So largely what you're going to see is, and I think a lot of your work suggests that, right? The inching towards accountability in Brazil says multiple reforms scattered, not necessarily intentional, had led us to this massive enforcement endeavor. I think the work of Fernando on the mixture of proportional representation with the presidential system has led actors to have to behave in a certain way, form coalitions in order to be able to govern. So once you change the institutions, the way to do politics will change, right? So I want to resist the idea that politics is at the heart of this, because I think politics will largely be determined by institutions. We could have a conversation about whether there is a chicken and egg problem here, which is, I think, something that Oscar referred to, which is in countries where institutions are not very strong or prominent, maybe politics will be the driving force. But in other situations where institutions have some power, maybe they will dictate politics. And maybe there are situations in which there is going to be a complex interaction here, which I think it's a research agenda for us to unpack each of this. But I wanted to make this point because I'm mindful that our audience are people who are just starting masters and doctorates in law. So the political scientists here are trying you to convince to cancel your matriculation in this program and run to the political sciences department. And I want to convince you to stay here. The law school is the place where a lot of action, interesting action will happen. So that's all. Thank you.
So thank you all for this very interesting panel and provocative and with a lot of research questions and problems. It's really a conversation that I I would not want to leave, and I'm sure we will continue discussing. And it's amazing how each time we meet, we can reassess our diagnosis and our evaluations of car wash in another way, facing other circumstances. So I think it's just one part of our dialogue. And thank you so much for all of you for the papers and for this very rich discussion. And I hope everybody can check the papers and the dossier. They are available on the two websites of Direito GV and University of Toronto Law Journal. Thank you so much for the whole morning.
Thank you.